Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth.
New at 6, the Trump administration has revoked a decision that would have protected roughly 600,000 Venezuelans from deportation. The move means some Venezuelans with TPS could be facing deportations as early as 2 months from now.
Daniela Basinisi is one of the thousands of Venezuelans with temporary protection status in South Florida. She labeled the extension of TPS as tying the hands of the new administration.
We are going to follow the process, evaluate all of these individuals that are in our country, including the Venezuelans that are here and members of TDA.
TDA is an abbreviation for Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang. The threat of the Venezuelan gang to national security was an issue addressed at this press conference. Who do you think is more at risk out of all those people?
The ones that committed crimes. They're going to be kicked out.
The news that we woke up for today must have been as frustrated as they have been for me, even for Trump supporters, because it hits home. It's different. It hits straight home.
Yeah, I know it hits differently, doesn't it? That wake-up call always hits differently.
I come from a very hard-working family. I've done everything by the law.
She works so hard. Last time I heard people talking like that, it was the Tethers, but they fell silent when Border Patrol was whipping them with those horse bridles. Yeah, migrants tend to glom onto whatever white media talking points they think will help them, and they love to say that thing about the immigrants are hardworking, etc., but white supremacy doesn't care about how hard you work. Slogans and talking points are not what white supremacy cares about. Yes, the ICE raids in New York and Chicago are PR stunts, obviously. Trump wants to be able to throw some red meat to the Fox News degenerates and say, we're taking action in those blue cities. So this is meant to appease the MAGA bottom feeders, because they've been talking about Chicago for the longest time, but haven't had anybody who was willing to actually go there and do, well, anything that would make them feel like, see, we're in charge. And now Trump is doing this, and this is supposed to go ahead and give them a sugar rush. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem decided to go on a ride-along for an ICE detainment action in New York City. And here I thought Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD looked stupid when he was walking behind Luigi what's-his-name who killed that healthcare CEO, acting as if he was the one who arrested him or something. But man, Adams looked almost believable compared to the utterly ridiculous-looking Kristi Noem. I mean, this woman looks like a clown. Then again, the orange man made no bones about the fact that he's running a circus. You have a cabinet-level official here running around with a bulletproof vest with a government-issue ball cap, and she's so tiny wearing these things. That vest looked like a portable tent. It was bigger than she was. And I wasn't the only one to notice that she decided to put on a ton of makeup and lipstick for this asinine photo op. I guess this is her idea of trying to glam up or something. She looked like a half-dead mannequin with all that pancake mix on her face. She needs to either hire a makeup person to handle her looks, or she needs to stay in her office. But going out in front of the world and making a spectacle of herself like this, not a good look. This is bad for a number of reasons, not the least of which being the more they do stuff like this, the less serious the administration appears. And we won't even discuss the newly confirmed Defense Secretary Hegseth and his claims that he's going to put 30,000 people in Guantanamo. It just goes to show all the members of the Trump White House are going out of their way to try to get headlines for themselves, but then again, team reflects leadership, as the old saying goes. But when it comes to Kristi Noem trying to make it look like she's personally leading all of these immigration raids, well, apparently she didn't realize the folks at home noticed that the story said she went into New York City with 90 ICE officers and cops, most of whom were there for her personal protection. And what did this 90-plus squad do? They arrested 20 individuals in 4 hours. 20. That's it. Now, according to Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, there's an estimated 470,000 illegal aliens who are living in his city. But of course, as crooked as Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD is, that number is surely far, far higher than that. But for the sake of this morning's briefing, we'll just go ahead and use that number. So, 20 illegals arrested in 4 hours. Well, at that rate, if they work at least 8 hours a day, every single day, including holidays and weekends, they might be able to arrest 14,600 illegals a year. 14,000 out of over 500,000. I think that's a tad bit shy of their goal. Also, there's reports that Native Americans are getting caught up in Trump's dragnet and that this is raising fears of racial profiling. Interesting. Racial profiling, they say. Gee, is that anything like when all these Native American tribes began targeting black tribal members and selectively expelling only the black ones? When they talk about racial profiling, they mean like that, right? Because if it's wrong for the orange man to round up people who have committed no crime and simply because of what they look like, then it was also wrong for these Native American tribes to do that to black people, right? And the reason that they did it, because there was federal money that they were supposed to be getting, and those non-black Indians wanted to take the black tribe members' money, so they, without any basis, just arbitrarily declared these people aren't real members of the tribe. Suddenly they decided that, even though they had been tribe members for hundreds of years. Now, why would they do that? Well, probably because the Red Indians were complicit in the slave trade. They were slave owners and acted as slave catchers too, and a lot of those Red Indian tribes allied themselves with the Confederacy during the Civil War. So these tribes had no problem with racial profiling and allying themselves with the U.S. government, and that being the case, when you take serpents to your bosom, you really have no grounds to complain when you get bit. And while there are the occasional stories about someone who is wrongly quote-unquote detained or what have you, the public opinion about all this is going to be no different than when El Salvador's government began mass arrest of gang members. People are going to look and say, well, if you're going to make that omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And while much of this is merely political theater for the cameras, that's not to say these high-profile stunts couldn't or are not having some effect. But in order for all of this to be meaningful, it's going to have to continue at more or less this same pace. Even when the headlines begin to slowly fade away, which they inevitably will, the news cycle will have to turn at some point. But if the government continues to keep rounding people up, and if the orange man continues to apply pressure to get these countries to take back their citizens, then after a few years, people might start realizing that breaking into the U.S. really isn't the free ride that it used to be. But the reason I included the bit about the Venezuelans at the beginning was because now that you have this rescission of this Biden-era policy that was going to expedite the citizenship of these individuals, what this means is you got Venezuelans who are going to be finding themselves having to go back to Venezuela. And if they have problems with their government back home, they're going to have to actually confront that government and change things as opposed to running from the fight. But understand something. A lot of the people who have been coming to the U.S. from Venezuela, what they thought they were going to do was that they were going to basically make themselves the new Cubans. In other words, the new Hispanic exiles from this or that regime who were going to come to the United States, and basically they were going to snuggle up to the Republican Party and say, hey, we're dealing with some sort of pseudo-socialist in our home country, and because of that, we want to be honorary members of the oppressor class. That's what you got going on in Florida. Some of the most mouth-frothing anti-black racists that you've ever seen have been those Cuban exiles and their relatives who have come to the United States. You got a bunch of folk from Venezuela, racist as the day is long against black people. And for a lot of them, the main thing that they've got against the current regime in Venezuela is because of the fact that the Maduro administration is continuing the policies of his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. And one of the things that Hugo Chavez did was he basically withdrew the clean bill of health that the Blancos had in the government down there. He started bringing in people who were not part of the Blanco ruling class. This displeased not only the individuals who were in charge there, but also the U.S. who had been getting a free ride from Venezuela's oil. And as far as they're concerned, hey, they're sitting on top of the largest oil reserve on the planet potentially. And that being the case, it's in the U.S.'s backyard. And if Chavez won't play ball, then they need to remove him and get somebody in there who will. But my point is, even though you and I can all see that the majority of the people coming in from Venezuela are not white, obviously these are brown people and some of them darker than that, nonetheless, they identify as white. That's how they see themselves. And as black Americans have observed, at least for the last 150 plus years, certainly since the Civil War, when the first massive waves of European immigrants began to come to the United States, all of these folk around the world, they already know what the racial situation is in the United States. They already know the rules of racism, and that if they're trying to apply to get themselves a place on the ladder higher than black folks, they know what they got to do. The audition process is you go ahead and make it clear that you are hostile toward foundational black Americans, and that's how you begin the process of getting your honorary member of the oppressor class card. And this is what's been happening for the longest time. Migrant gangs have been targeting black residents and even legal migrants who have been just as racist toward black Americans. And this is what happens when people begin to think of themselves as honorary members of the oppressor class. In Latin America, the Blancos run everything. And they don't let the mestizos even pretend to think of themselves as white. But in the U.S., because that distinction wasn't officially made until the 1970s, and because these state and even federal governments played along and allowed people to claim to be white on driver's licenses and census forms, a lot of those immigrants thought that that meant they were actually on the team. But white supremacy wasn't fooled. and only played along for as long as it suited them. And now they're showing what they've always thought. And the one thing that seems to be surprising these immigrants the most is that there is no huge national uproar against this. Where are the throngs of demonstrations nationwide, people filling the streets? It's not there, it's not happening, and it's not coming. ICE is running around doing stupid photo ops in New York and Chicago, these blue cities, and the only people who are upset about it are the politicians there, at least in Chicago. In New York, the political response has been far more muted. I guess this means the millionaires and billionaires in that city already have all the housekeepers and cleaning staff they need, and considering that Donald Trump occasionally calls New York home, it makes sense that his neighbors are on the same page with him. And while all of this is going on, where is the Congressional Black Caucus at? Or the Congressional Black Talkers, I should say. While the black grassroots have made it clear that all these groups who have spent the last 3 generations spitting in our faces, well, everybody's going to have to hold their own now, where's the CBC at? They want to go ahead and do some sort of stupid photo op press conference and speak up for all of this. We need to be welcoming everybody. Is that what they're doing? No. Their focus is on fighting the war to maintain DEI initiatives. And while I agree that DEI is the latest right-wing acronym soup term manufactured to be a euphemism for black, it's also true that the CBC hasn't done anything to stand up for any sort of policy that benefits black people at all. These guys are the epitome of useless. Where have they been at to organize their votes and hold up legislation in Congress until they get certain laws passed? They don't do it. They've got leverage, but they don't dare use it. Same way those bootlicking, butt-kissing, buck-dancing Uncle Toms and Aunt Tamika sellouts in the California Black Legislative Caucus did absolutely nothing for black people in that state either, though they did make time to be Gavin Newsom's crash dummies to block that reparations bill. But it makes sense that the CBC is laying low right now. As I detailed for you, a disproportionate number of the Congressional Black Caucus, if not outright majority, are immigrants. And that includes their current so-called leader, Stephen Horsford. And just in case you have any doubts about where this guy stands when it comes to immigration and whether or not he's decided to prioritize people who aren't even citizens over foundational black Americans, here's a video of him from his own Facebook page.
Rosen, this is about family. Immigration has always been about family. My mother came to the United States at 12 years old from Trinidad with my grandmother. And while my grandmother pursued the American dream and worked hard, my mom went to school. But because of a broken immigration system, after my grandmother got sick, my mom ended up overstaying her visa and became undocumented. She's now a legal permanent resident. So when I hear the stories of moms and dreamers and families who are worried about keeping their families together, the 6,300 people in Nevada who are worried about TPS protection, and so many more who are worried because we have a broken system, know that you are not forgotten. Yeah. Know that we are fighting for you and your family. And one of the reasons I'm running for Congress is because I will never forget where I've come from or what I'm fighting for.
So there you have it. The head of the Congressional Black Caucus is himself the child of illegal immigrants, and that being the case, he identifies with that. He doesn't even talk about being black. It's all about being an immigrant. And considering the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus, like the rest of these dead-end civil rights fossils, they're all trying to find a way to rebrand themselves because the younger black folks who are under the age of 55, these folks have said to hell with these guys, we're abandoning them because they turned their backs on us. And now they're trying to find a way to rebrand themselves and reach out to anyone and everyone except for black people, and he's part of that. So let's go and get one of their own to be the leader of our group, and he'll tell them how his mother was an illegal alien and how he himself, he's standing up for them. And we're not going to say anything about slavery. We're not going to say anything about black people. We're certainly not going to call out anti-black racism that comes from the Latino community. In fact, we're trying to get away from all of that. We're trying to de-racialize ourselves. And instead, we're going to be just a plain vanilla, pun intended, civil rights organization. And we'll be advocating for stuff that really matters. You know, things like abortion and transgender bathrooms, because those are the really big issues that are facing the black community, though we're not going to say black. Did you get all that? That was from his own Facebook page. He posted that because he wanted folks to know this is where I stand on the issue. He talks about how his mother came to the U.S. from Trinidad, and apparently his grandmother was already here. She overstayed her visa. He claims it because his grandmother got sick. Now, is anyone buying that story? And he then immediately connects his story to the so-called dreamers, who are from Latin America, by the way. And they come from cultures that practice rampant, violent, anti-black racism, and he says he's fighting for them. Now, the dreamers already have congressional representation. It's called the Hispanic Caucus. And here you got the leader of the so-called Congressional Black Caucus, and this guy makes absolutely no pretense at all that he's representing us. He doesn't even pretend that he is. And he makes no connection between himself and us at all. He's not black. He's an immigrant. He said it with his chest, full stop. And that's because as a tether, he's able to access all kinds of government programs because he is an immigrant. And the same thing went for his mother and his grandmother. And the dominant society looks at him differently precisely because they know that he didn't come from the killing fields of the American South. The white supremacists are observant, if nothing else. They have long understood the necessity of being able to accurately put people into certain categories, at least certain categories as it serves the interest and the preservation of the power of white supremacy. Simply put, those of us who had to break the chains of slavery in this country, we're built differently. And we see this not just in the Americas, but around the world. And that's no shade, that's no disrespect. We got plenty of B-1 soldiers from the diaspora whose folks also put in work and earned their stripes. But my point is, the dominant society across the board, they understand that when they got black folks who are coming from abroad, well, they don't seem to have the quote-unquote chip on their shoulder that foundational black Americans do. And that chip on the shoulder happens to be the absolute dogged determination that we are going to institute a system of justice here and overthrow white supremacy, which will put an end to the system of goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that they've relied on for 500 years. Only the right stuff survived the living hell of American slavery, and that being the case, yes, as a result, we are built differently. You would be hard-pressed to find a foundational black American going to any other country, certainly not one with a sizable black population, and start talking that gibberish that racism isn't that much of a problem, and they've never really been bothered by that, but it's no big deal. You would be hard-pressed to find anyone who would be stupid enough to talk like that from our ranks. And here this Tether Horsford is, and he's going to call himself trying to co-opt our history, our struggle, our story, and our moral accomplishments, and then falsely claim that because he has a certain amount of melanin, that somehow he can go ahead and claim that his folks were somehow connected to or otherwise involved with slavery and Jim Crow. So it had something to do with him somehow, as if his folks were there all alongside us. By his own admission, his folks hadn't even gotten to the U.S. yet. We are not immigrants. We are survivors of the worst Holocaust in human history. And not only has this Holocaust not been atoned for, it's still ongoing. See, in other countries, it's the culture to go ahead and be dishonest, which is why they can never build together. They can't trust each other. Their loyalty system isn't merely broken, it's completely disintegrated. And nobody wants to have to do the hard work of reconstituting a new one. And that's the reason why Pan-Africanism was always damned to fail from the very beginning. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke said himself, you cannot have an alliance unless you have the ability to punish anyone in the alliance who breaks the alliance. But it also needs to be said you can't have an alliance of one. Both parties have to be equally committed to be allied to one another. So far, what we had was not a two-way street. It was a one-way road. And that doesn't work. And speaking of people who don't work, I have noticed, like everybody else, that the Republicans are saying that the 14th Amendment had to do with slavery. And that is good that these guys are at least saying that, not because they're committed to us, but because of the fact that they're saying it with their own mouths. And I hope that they keep that same energy when it comes to these corporations who claim that in the eyes of the law, corporations are to be looked at as persons, because these corporations also abuse the 14th Amendment to create that legal lie. In fact, the 14th Amendment has been used, abused, and raped to benefit everyone from mothers who want to terminate their babies, to illegal aliens who aren't even citizens, to corporations who aren't even human beings. Everybody has jumped on the 14th Amendment and twisted it and perverted it in order to fit their own desires for power and to prop up their own petty political demands. That's what's been going on for at least the last 100-some-odd years. And yet, foundational black Americans, who are the people who fought to get those laws on the books and are the only ones who those laws were actually written for, have been categorically ignored and denied the benefit of the very laws that we brought into being. What we see happening right now is exactly what the black community in general and the black media in specific have been saying was going to occur for a very long time. And you had these folks here who apparently thought to themselves that they were somehow immune from all of this, that America hadn't hadn't done anything like this in such a long time, so these white supremacists, they were civilized, and hey, they're all on the same team against black people, so it's all good, right? They're seeing the reality now. As the raids and the detentions continue to mount, a lot of people who thought they had found a comfortable place under white supremacy and thought that harming black people was a victimless crime, they're now seeing that their would-be friends are showing them the door. And I can't really be upset about it. Black people have warned all these groups from the very beginning that they were crawling into bed with the devil, but as they saw it, they were getting some crumbs from Mass's table, and they thought being helped to leapfrog over black people. And will they be able to mount some sort of substantive counter-push against this? Well, having never practiced standing up to white aggression in their home countries, they're going to bend like taffy on a summer day to the orange man. For our part, however, we're not taking sides, because we don't get involved in third-party disputes. The tethers who have spent the last few years pretending to speak for us, and who were always the first ones to jump in front of a camera to stick up for non-citizens, you notice how they're nowhere to be seen now? It's because they themselves don't want to become targets, true, but it's also because we, as the black media, successfully pushed for delineation. So people are starting to understand that whenever they see some black person on TV or on the internet who seems too eager and irrationally hell-bound to be an advocate for everybody else except for us, this person isn't speaking for anyone but themselves. The message has begun to get through, and most importantly, it's gotten through with the people who needed to hear it the most, and that happens to be young black people. It's permeated down to the black folks who really need to hear this message so that they can internalize it. That's how you change the culture. And while of course we still have a hell of a lot of work ahead of us, and none of us are pleased to see the congressional black talkers slamming their gums, the reality is when it comes to cultural changes, shifting who's going to be in those positions of leadership, that's actually a lagging indicator. Things start with people who actually have resolved that changes need to happen and what those changes are. We later on start to see the individuals who are ensconced in these positions by white power wind up inevitably finding themselves forced out. That comes later, which is why it is crucial that we continue to push, that we continue to delegitimize these tethers and bootlicks and empty mouthpieces. We make clear that everybody understands these people are nothing more than a bunch of frauds and charlatans. They do not speak for us, and that we will not rest until we have people in those positions who do speak for us. These self-appointed tether spokespeople, they're getting their wake-up call too, only it's not coming from the orange man. Their wake-up call is coming from us. As for the Republicans' sudden reacquaintance with the Constitution, we're going to take note of the GOP's words because they will be useful for us later on as we press our own demands. But don't kid yourselves. No matter how the GOP is giving minor lip service to what's right today, they'll be denying it tomorrow, which is why it's important for us that we handcuff them to their own words. As I've said a million times, white supremacy has no principles, and this also goes double for those who chose to ally themselves with white supremacy. All they have is situational ethics and moral relativism. All of these beneficiaries of anti-black racism, they'll say whatever they think is in their interest at any given moment. And depending on how much pressure they're under, they're likely to say anything. But whatever it is, it won't be the truth. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Michael Clark, Atu Hammond, Rebellious Zoe, Reasonable Dude, and Richard Griffith. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.